I'm Hannah, 32 years old, and I learned the hard way that silence can wound deeper than words. I didn't expect it to happen that day. I told myself Thanksgiving was different, safer. I believed holidays forced people to behave, especially when there were witnesses. I thought a full table and shared traditions would keep things civil. I convinced myself, foolishly, that no one would dare make a point that cruel in front of 23 relatives. I walked through the front door carrying my grandmother's pecan pie, the same recipe she taught me years ago when I was still allowed to sit at her kitchen table and matter. Browned butter crust, dark, glossy filling, the smell of toasted pecans and vanilla wrapped around me like a memory I wasn't ready to let go of. That pie wasn't just dessert. It was proof that at least one person in this family had loved me without conditions. The house was already full. Voices drifted from the dining room, overlapping and warm. Laughter bounced off the walls. Glasses clinked. Everyone was seated. Everyone had a place. I stepped forward, ready to slip quietly into the background like I always did, and that's when I noticed it. The table was completely set. White plates, polished silverware, crystal glasses, handwritten name cards placed neatly in front of every chair. I scanned the table once. Then again, slower this time, my stomach tightening with each pass. I didn't see my name. I counted under my breath. 23 place cards. 23 chairs. There were 24 people in the house. For a moment, I honestly thought it was a mistake. That someone would notice. That a chair would be pulled from the corner. That this would be fixed quietly, without comment. I stood there holding the pie, heat bleeding into my palms, my heart starting to race. No one moved. A few relatives glanced at me, then looked away. Conversations dipped and then resumed. The room adjusted around my presence without acknowledging it, the way it always had. My mother turned toward me. Her face showed no surprise, no confusion, just that familiar, distant expression I'd grown up with. The one that said she'd already decided how this moment would go. "There's no room for disappointments," she said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't sound angry. She said it like a fact, like a rule that had always existed, and I was foolish for questioning it. Something inside me went very still. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I'd learned a long time ago that reacting only gave them proof that I was, once again, the problem. Instead, I looked around the table. 23 people. My blood. My history. People who had watched me drop out of college to take care of my mother during cancer treatments. People who had benefited from my sacrifices without ever thanking me. People who had seen me shrink year after year and never once asked why. Not one person spoke. No one told my mother she'd gone too far. No one asked where my chair was. No one said my name. And that silence hurt more than the words ever could. Because words can be challenged. Words can be argued with. Silence offers no opening. Silence is agreement. Silence is everyone deciding, together, that you are not worth the discomfort of speaking up. I walked slowly to the head of the table. My father sat there, posture perfect, eyes distant. He wore the same empty expression he'd worn my entire life. Not anger, not hatred, just absence. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. It was thick, heavy, weighted with 6 months of waiting and 32 years of questions. I placed it on his plate. "Happy Thanksgiving," I said calmly. "I finally understand why you hate me." The room froze. Forks hovered midair. Someone inhaled sharply. My sister's smile faltered for half a second before she forced it back into place. My mother's face drained of color and then hardened. "The DNA results inside answered questions I've had my whole life," I continued. "But they also raised one bigger question, one nobody in this room can answer." Still, silence. I set the pie down carefully on the table, directly in front of the empty space where my chair should have been. No one moved to make room. No one invited me to sit. No one defended me. And in that moment, something finally clicked. It wasn't just my mother who had failed me. It was everyone. The aunts who whispered instead of asking. The uncles who accepted my absence as normal. The cousins who never bothered to know who I really was. The father who chose comfort over courage every single time. Their silence wasn't passive. It was a choice. Standing there, watching them stay quiet, I realized I had spent my entire life trying to earn noise. A defense. A reaction. Proof that I mattered enough to disrupt the room. But there was never going to be a chair for me at that table. Not because there wasn't space. Because my absence made their version of the story easier to live with. And that Thanksgiving, for the first time in my life, I stopped asking them to make room. Thanksgiving felt like the explosion, but the fuse had been burning for months. The first crack appeared 6 months earlier, on the day my grandmother died. That was the day I realized, slowly and painfully, that I had never truly belonged to the family I kept trying to earn. The funeral home smelled like lilies and floor polish. Clean. Artificial. Respectable. I arrived an hour early because that's what my grandmother, Evelyn Parker, taught me. Early meant you cared. Early meant you were dependable. Being dependable was how I survived. I wanted to help. I always wanted to help. If I was useful, I could justify my presence. My mother was already there, clipboard in hand, directing the staff like she was managing an event instead of burying her own mother. "Marissa," she said without looking up. "Stand by the entrance and greet people." I hesitated. "I thought I'd sit with the family." She finally raised her eyes. "The front row is for immediate family," she said. "People who were close to your grandmother." The words landed harder than I expected. Not because they were cruel, but because they were delivered like policy. Like this wasn't open for discussion. My sister, Brooke, arrived later, perfectly dressed, eyes already glossy with grief that looked practiced. My mother wrapped her in a hug like she was fragile glass. "You must be exhausted," she said loudly. I stood by the guest book and watched them take their seats in the front row. Brooke between my parents. A perfect picture of family mourning. I stayed in the back. The service was beautiful. People talked about my grandmother's kindness, her generosity, her devotion to family. Every compliment felt like a private ache. She had been my safe place, the only person who loved me without conditions. Afterward, people lined up to offer condolences. I shook hands, accepted hugs, corrected relatives who called me by the wrong name. Then a man in a gray suit approached me. "Miss Parker?" he asked. "Yes. I'm Daniel Hargrove, your grandmother's attorney." My stomach tightened immediately. "She left something specifically for you," he said, then paused. "But I'll need time to verify a few details first." "What kind of details?" I asked. "I'll be in touch." That was the moment the truth started moving toward me, even though I didn't know it yet. To understand why that mattered, you need to know what the years before looked like. I was 22 when my mother was diagnosed with stage 1 breast cancer, junior year of college. Double major. Plans I'd worked for. The family meeting was quick. My father Richard sat at the head of the table. My mother beside him, suddenly fragile. Brooke was 20, pre-med, already accepted into an accelerated program. "Someone needs to stay home," my father said. "Brooke can't interrupt her studies." Everyone looked at me. "I'll do it," I said. I asked my grandmother about it once. "Your mother has a secret," she told me softly, "and until she faces it, she'll keep punishing you instead of herself." 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, my phone rang early in the morning. "The envelope couldn't be released until 6 months after your grandmother's passing," Daniel said. "She wanted to give you time to grieve." When I met him, he handed me a thick envelope sealed with red wax. "For Marissa. When you're ready to know the truth." I didn't open it right away. But Thanksgiving was coming. And deep down, I knew that envelope wasn't just holding answers. It was holding the reason. I didn't open the envelope right away. I wish I could say I was brave. That the moment it landed in my hands, I tore it open and faced whatever truth my grandmother had left me. But I wasn't. I slid it into the top drawer of my nightstand and pretended it wasn't there. Like if I didn't touch it, it couldn't change anything. Every night, though, I knew exactly where it was. I told myself I needed time to grieve my grandmother first. That opening it too soon would somehow betray her. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was afraid. Afraid that whatever was inside would confirm what I'd felt my entire life. Afraid it would take away the last excuse I had for why my family treated me the way they did. If there was a reason, then the pain had a shape. If there wasn't, then it meant they'd chosen this anyway. 5 days before Thanksgiving, my mother called. That alone should have warned me something was coming. We didn't talk on the phone unless there was a task involved. Thanksgiving is at our house this year, she said. Everyone will be there. Okay, I replied. Clarissa has an announcement. Something important. There was a pause, heavy with meaning. I'll bring Grandma Evelyn's pecan pie, I said automatically. Fine, she said. Arrive early. We'll need help. She hung up without saying goodbye. That night, I stood in my bedroom holding the envelope again. The red wax seal was still intact. My grandmother's handwriting stared back at me, steady and familiar. For Marissa. When you're ready to know the truth, Thanksgiving was coming. Clarissa's announcement was coming. Another performance where I'd smile, serve, and disappear was coming. And suddenly, I knew I couldn't walk into that house without knowing what was inside this envelope. Not this time. I sat on the floor with my back against the bed and broke the seal. Inside were several documents and a handwritten letter, folded carefully. I started with the letter because it felt wrong not to. My grandmother's voice came alive the moment I read the first line. My darling Marissa, I'm sorry. The apology hit me first. Harder than I expected. Grandma Evelyn had never been someone who apologized lightly. If she said she was sorry, it meant she believed she had failed me. I read slowly, my hands starting to shake. She wrote about fear. About carrying a secret for more than 30 years. About watching me grow up under a weight I didn't understand. She admitted she'd noticed it early, the way my mother looked at me differently, not with warmth, but with something closer to guilt. The way my father kept his distance, polite but cold. Then I reached the sentence that changed everything. You are not Richard's biological daughter. I stared at the words until they blurred. I reread them. Then again. My chest felt tight, like the air had been sucked out of the room. 32 years of confusion snapped into alignment all at once. The coldness, the favoritism, the way my existence seemed to irritate my mother on a level I could never explain. My grandmother wrote that she'd had suspicions for years. That she told herself she was imagining things. That 2 years before she died, she stopped pretending. She explained how she'd taken samples quietly, a hairbrush from her bathroom when I stayed over, a glass my father used at Sunday dinner. She sent them to a private lab, unable to live with the uncertainty any longer. The results were enclosed. I set the letter down and unfolded the report. The words were clinical, detached, brutal, in their precision. Probability of paternity. 0%. 0. Not low. Not unlikely. Impossible. I sat there on the floor, papers spread around me like evidence at a crime scene, my entire childhood rearranging itself in my mind. Every moment that had confused me suddenly made sense. Every time my mother flinched when I hugged her. Every time my father looked through me like I was furniture. Every opportunity given to my sister that I was told I didn't deserve. It hadn't been random. It hadn't been because I wasn't good enough. It was because every time they looked at me, they saw a lie they didn't want to face. My grandmother wrote that she'd confronted my mother, that my mother had begged her not to tell anyone, that she'd said if my father found out he'd leave, that it would destroy the family, that it would ruin Clarissa's life. And so, for decades, the solution had been me. Punish the reminder. Push her aside. Rewrite the narrative so no one would ever question why she was treated differently. I read the letter until the ink swam. My grandmother apologized again. For not being braver. For not telling me sooner. For letting my mother turn me into a receptacle for her shame. You didn't deserve any of it, she wrote. Not one day. I didn't sleep that night. I sat there until the sun came up, staring at the walls, at the documents, at a life that finally made sense in the most devastating way possible. I felt grief, anger, relief, and something like validation all tangled together. I wasn't broken. I wasn't defective. I wasn't difficult. I was inconvenient. I had two choices. I could put the papers back in the envelope, show up at Thanksgiving, stand in the kitchen, pass the dishes, accept my place as the family disappointment, and never ask another question. Or I could stop being quiet. I photocopied the documents and slid the originals into my safe. The copies went into a fresh envelope. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't planning drama. I was planning honesty. Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and bright. The envelope sat in my coat pocket, heavier than before. I promised myself I wouldn't use it unless they forced my hand. One more chance. One final chance for someone, anyone, to make room for me without being pushed. I walked into that house believing I might not need the envelope at all. By the time my mother said there was no room for disappointments, I understood something else too. My grandmother hadn't just given me the truth. She'd given me permission. And once you have that, silence is no longer an option. By the time Thanksgiving morning arrived, I already knew the truth. What I didn't know yet was how deeply my family would confirm it. I woke up with that envelope still sitting in my coat pocket, heavier than it had been the night before. Not because the contents had changed, but because I had. Once you know the truth, you can't unknow it. You can only decide what you're willing to tolerate going forward. I stood in my apartment, staring at myself in the mirror, asking a question I'd never allowed myself to ask before. What if the problem was never me? What if I hadn't failed them at all? What if the love I'd been chasing was something they were never capable of giving? I drove to my parents' house with the radio off. The road felt too loud for noise. When I pulled into the driveway, my sister's white SUV was already there, parked perfectly, like everything else about her life. The house looked warm and inviting from the outside. Wreath on the door, candles glowing in the windows. A picture of togetherness that had nothing to do with reality. My mother opened the door before I could knock. "You're late," she said. "I'm 10 minutes early," I replied. "I asked for an hour early," she snapped, already turning away. "We're behind." The house smelled like turkey and cinnamon candles. 24 place settings circled the long dining table. I felt a brief, foolish flicker of hope. Maybe they'd fixed it. Maybe there was a chair for me after all. Then I looked closer. I walked around the table once. Then again. There were still only 23 name cards. "Mom," I said quietly. "Where's my seat?" She didn't look at me. "You'll eat in the kitchen after." After. After the family finished. After the celebration. After I'd done whatever work was needed. Like always. "There are 24 places," I said. "There are only 23 names." My sister appeared in the doorway then, one hand resting possessively on her pregnant belly, smiling like she owned the room. "The last seat is for the baby," she said brightly. "We even made a little card. Isn't it cute?" I stared at the card. A name that didn't exist yet. A placeholder for someone who hadn't even been born. "You replaced me," I said. "With someone who doesn't exist yet." "Don't be dramatic," she replied. "It's symbolic." Symbolique. That was the word they always used when they wanted to make cruelty sound reasonable. I followed my mother into the kitchen, my heart pounding. This was the moment. The private moment where things might finally be said. Where a mother might look at her daughter and explain herself. "Mom," I said, "I need to talk to you." "Not now," she said sharply. "I'm busy. I dropped out of school for you," I said. "I took care of you when you were sick. And you can't even give me a chair." She turned then, eyes cold. "You dropped out because you couldn't handle it," she said. "Don't rewrite history. You asked me to stay. You had a job," she snapped. "Helping this family. That's what you were good for." The words landed like ice water. Good for you. Not loved. Not valued. Useful. I felt the envelope press against my chest through my coat. The truth burning there, waiting. I held it back. One more chance. Just one. My father was no better. When I found him alone later and asked why he allowed this, he didn't defend me. He didn't deny it either. He just said, "Your mother decides." Then, quieter, "You're your mother's daughter." Something in his voice told me there was more behind that sentence than I understood at the time. Something heavy, something rehearsed. By the time guests arrived, I was already invisible again. I stood by the door greeting people. I fetched drinks. I carried dishes. I watched relatives. I barely knew laugh and belong in ways I never had. When my father gave his toast, he thanked his wife. He praised my sister. He celebrated the unborn baby. He didn't mention me once, not even as an afterthought. And that was when it hit me with brutal clarity. I was never meant to win their love. There was nothing I could have done differently. No version of myself that would have been enough. I could have been quieter, smarter, more obedient, more successful. It wouldn't have mattered. Because love built on lies always needs a scapegoat. And I was it. When my sister stood up to toast and thanked me for holding things down while she chased her dreams, the room murmured approval. They nodded like she'd said something generous. I stood there holding serving dishes, feeling something in me finally detach. Reliable. Dependable. Steady. Those were the words people use when they want to thank you without respecting you. I heard relatives whispering in the other room later. About how I was difficult. About how my mother had tried her best. About how some people just don't turn out right. And I understood something devastating. They didn't just believe my mother's story. They needed it. Because believing I was the problem meant they never had to question the family itself. When I carried my grandmother's pie out after dinner, and my mother told me to take it back to the kitchen, something inside me finally stopped trying. "You don't have a seat at this table," she said loudly. "What makes you think your pie belongs here?" That was the moment. Not the insult. Not the exclusion. The certainty. I realized I had spent my life playing a game I was never meant to win. A game where the rules changed constantly, and the prize was always just out of reach. And standing there, with 23 people watching and saying nothing, I finally stopped trying. I didn't need their approval anymore, because I finally understood why I'd never earned it. And that understanding was about to change everything. I didn't plan the moment I walked away. I didn't rehearse it, or imagine how strong I'd look doing it. All I knew was that something inside me had shifted, and once it did, there was no way to force it back into place. You can survive a lot when you believe things will eventually get better. But the second you realize they never will, staying becomes impossible. After my mother said there was no room at the table for disappointments, the room went silent in a way I had never experienced before. Not awkward silence. Not uncomfortable silence. This was the kind of silence that happens when people know something irreversible has just occurred. When a line has been crossed and everyone understands there's no pretending it didn't happen. 23 faces stared at me. Some looked shocked. Some looked curious. A few looked relieved, like they'd been waiting for this moment so they could finally justify things they'd felt but never questioned. No one defended me. No one stood up. No one told my mother she'd gone too far. And I realized something then that hit harder than any insult ever could. They weren't surprised. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a moment of poor judgment. This was the natural conclusion of a story they'd all silently agreed to for decades. I was the disappointing one. The difficult one. The one it was easiest to exclude because no one had ever bothered to really know me. I set my grandmother's pie down on the table carefully. Not because they deserved gentleness, but because she did. That recipe wasn't theirs to reject. It was hers, and mine. I reached into my coat pocket and took out the envelope. My mother's face changed instantly. Not anger, not sadness, fear. That was the first time I'd ever seen fear on her face because of me. But what stayed with me wasn't what they said. It was what they didn't say. No one apologized. No one asked how long I'd known. No one asked how it felt to grow up being treated like an inconvenience instead of a daughter. Even in the moment when the truth was finally undeniable, their instinct wasn't to reach for me. It was to protect themselves. And that's when I knew, with absolute certainty, that there was nothing left for me in that house. I didn't yell. I didn't insult anyone. I didn't demand explanations or closure. I simply picked up my coat, turned toward the door, and walked away. No jealousy, no anger, no longing to be seen as her equal. Just clarity. She had spent her entire life being loved without question. I had spent mine trying to earn scraps. And neither of us had chosen those roles. But only one of us had benefited from them. I told her the truth quietly. That I wasn't destroying anything. That the truth had already existed long before I spoke it. That I was just done carrying it alone. She asked if we were still sisters. And for the first time, I didn't rush to reassure her. I told her we shared a mother. That was all. I stepped out into the cold November air and felt something unfamiliar settle over me. Not relief. Not happiness. Freedom. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt terrifying. Walking away from your family isn't brave in the way people like to imagine. It feels like stepping off a cliff without knowing whether there's ground below you. It feels lonely, quiet, final. But it also feels honest. My parents' marriage began to unravel. My mother tried to control the story, but the truth doesn't stay contained once it's spoken. Relatives started calling. Some apologized. Some explained. Some just wanted reassurance that they weren't bad people. I didn't give it to them. I stopped answering calls that made my chest tighten. I stopped explaining myself to people who had been comfortable misunderstanding me for years. I stopped chasing approval from people who only loved me when I was quiet and useful. I moved into a small apartment above a bakery. I enrolled in classes I'd put off for years. I took a promotion at work because I finally believed I deserved it. I built a life that didn't revolve around earning a place at someone else's table. Sometimes I still think about my biological father. I don't know if I'll ever meet him. Maybe I will. Maybe I won't. But for the first time in my life, that question doesn't define me. Because I finally understand something my grandmother tried to teach me all along. I was never a mistake. I was never the problem. I was never too much or not enough. I was simply born into a family that needed silence more than truth, and someone always has to pay for that. This story doesn't end with forgiveness. It doesn't end with a reunion or a neat resolution. It ends with me sitting at my own table now, with chairs I chose, in a life I'm finally allowed to take up space in. Walking away didn't fix everything, but it fixed me. And if you've ever been hurt more by silence than by words, I hope you know this. You are allowed to leave tables where you're not welcome. You are allowed to stop shrinking. And choosing yourself is not abandonment. It's survival.